You know how sometimes international trade feels like this big, complicated game, and you hear about things like tariffs, and it's just, well, it's a lot.
Yeah, it definitely can be.
Especially when you realize there are different kinds of tariffs. So today, we're going to try and make sense of two of the main players, regular tariffs and reciprocal tariffs.
That's right. And you've dug into some really useful stuff that helps us see the difference, looking at both how tariffs have been used historically and this more recent push towards reciprocal ones.
Exactly. We've got historical examples, some solid economic thinking from various sources, and even a real-world look at the reciprocal tariffs the Trump administration announced back in April 2025.
Hmm.
So what we're aiming to do here, our mission really, is to give you a clear picture of what reciprocal tariffs are all about, and crucially, how they stack up against the more common regular tariffs we often hear about.
Sounds good.
Okay, so to get us started, what's the fundamental idea behind a regular tariff?
Simply put, a regular tariff is basically a tax. It's a tax that a country puts on goods coming in from other countries.
Okay, a tax on imports.
Exactly. And it's been around for ages. Historically, countries have used them for, well, a couple of main reasons.
Such that.
Well, way back in the early days of the U.S., one of the big reasons was just to bring in money for the government.
Right, revenue.
Yeah, revenue. Think about the Hamilton tariff back in 1789. That was a key way the new federal government funded itself.
Makes sense.
But tariffs also have a long history of being used to sort of shield homegrown industries from cheaper competition from overseas.
Ah, protectionism.
Right. Guys like Alexander Hamilton and later McKinley were big on this infant industry idea, giving new American businesses some breathing room to grow strong without getting swamped immediately.
And we still see that today, right?
Oh, absolutely. We've seen it with things like the U.S. tariffs on steel a few years back, or even ongoing situations like the tariffs we have on sugar, certain types of vehicles.
It's funny how some of these arguments just keep popping up throughout history. And it wasn't like everyone in the U.S. always agreed on tariffs, was it? I remember reading that different political groups had different takes.
Definitely not.
Mm-hmm.
If you look back, the Republican Party, historically, was often in favor of higher tariffs to really protect American manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
Democrats, generally speaking, tended to see tariffs more as a way to generate revenue, with protection being maybe a secondary goal.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Even with these straightforward regular tariffs, things can get tricky pretty fast.
How so?
Well, imagine you put a tariff on steel coming into the country. Okay, that might help American steel makers, right?
Sure.
But what about the car companies here that rely on imported steel? Suddenly, their costs go up.
Ah, right. Makes them less competitive.
Exactly. They're less competitive, maybe on the global market, maybe even at home. It's a bit of a balancing act, and sometimes you fix one problem, or think you do, only to create another one downstream.
Yeah, it's like that domino effect. You try to help one part of the economy and it knocks over something else. And I was surprised to learn that for a long time, the U.S. actually had some of the highest average tariff rates on manufactured goods coming in.
That's true. For a good stretch, really from around 1816 all the way up to the Second World War, the U.S. was pretty protectionist in its trade policies.
Okay.
But then, after the war, there was this big shift, a real move towards lowering tariffs, opening up trade.
That's when things like GOTT
Yeah,
is.
precisely. Agreements like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, and later the World Trade Organization, the WTO, they really pushed for this more open system.
And that's where this idea of most favored nation, or MFN, comes in.
Mhm.
Can you break that down for us? Think of it like the everyone gets the best deal rule in the WTO club.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Basically, under WTO rules, MFN says that if a country offers a special low tariff rate to one member of the WTO, it generally has to offer that same low rate to all other WTO members.
So, no playing favorites, mostly.
Right. If the U.S. decides to lower the tariff on, say, German-made widgets, it usually has to offer that same lower rate to widget makers in Japan or Canada and so on.
Okay.
Now, it's important to remember, MFN doesn't mean all tariffs are zero, or even the same across the board. Countries can still have different rates for different products, and rates can vary between countries. But the core idea is non-discrimination among WTO members. You can't just arbitrarily give one country a much better deal than everyone else in the club.
Okay, so that gives us a good handle on regular tariffs. Now, let's switch gears. Let's talk about reciprocal tariffs. How are they different in their approach? They sound kind of similar just from the name.
Yeah, the name can be a bit misleading. Reciprocal tariffs are a different beast altogether. They're much more about reacting directly to what other countries are doing, or at least that's the stated goal.
Reacting how?
Well, the basic idea is that one country will slap tariffs on goods coming from another country that are supposedly equivalent or similar to the tariffs that the other country has on its own exports.
Okay, so trying to level the playing field.
Exactly. It's often framed that way, achieving fairness or balance in trade.
And we saw a recent example of this with the Trump administration's announcement in April 2025. But the way those reciprocal tariffs were worked out, it seemed a bit, well, not exactly a direct match based on what I read.
You're absolutely spot on there. While they were called reciprocal, these specific tariffs weren't simply mirroring the tariff rates that other countries had listed on their books.
No. So how were they calculated?
Instead, the U.S. government used a formula based on the trade deficit, specifically the bilateral trade deficit.
The trade deficit, how does that work?
The reciprocal tariff percentage was calculated by taking the U.S. trade deficit with a particular country and dividing it by the total value of U.S. imports from that country.
Wait, so let me get this straight. It wasn't country X charges 10% on our widgets, so we'll charge 10% on their gizmos.
Nope, not at all.
It was based on the overall trade imbalance between the U.S. and that country. Huh. That seems indirect. It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by measuring how much water has already spilled, not by actually tightening the tap itself.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. As one of our sources pointed out, the resulting U.S. tariff rates had, and I quote, no direct relationship with the published tariff schedules of other nations.
Wow.
So a country could have relatively low official tariff rates on U.S. goods, but if they had a large trade surplus with the U.S., meaning a deficit for the U.S., they could get hit with really high U.S. tariffs under this system.
So it's more of a blunt instrument then, not really targeted reciprocity on specific products?
Precisely. It's based on that overall trade balance figure relative to import volume.
That's a really important distinction. So what kind of tariff rates were we actually talking about under this deficit-based approach? Were they uniform?
No, they ranged quite a bit. Initially, there was talk of a minimum, maybe 10% applied across the board to countries meeting certain criteria related to their deficits.
Oh.
But the formula itself could lead to much, much higher rates.
Yeah.
It went all the way up to 49% in some cases. I think Lesotho was an example cited.
49%? That's huge.
It is. And that wide range directly reflected the different trade deficit to import volume ratios for each country targeted.
Okay, and how does calculating tariffs this way, based on trade deficits, fit into the existing international trade rules? You know, the WTO framework, MFN, all that stuff we just talked about.
Yeah, this is where things get, well, let's say complicated or contentious.
Uh-oh.
The WTO framework, with its MFN principle, is really built on non-discrimination and agreed-upon bound tariff rates for specific products. Countries agree not to just arbitrarily favor one member over another.
Right.
Calculating tariffs based on a bilateral trade deficit isn't really part of that established WTO rulebook.
Yeah.
Member countries didn't agree to set their tariffs at some universally low level, and they certainly didn't agree to adjust them based on this kind of deficit calculation.
So this was definitely stepping outside the usual way things are done under WTO norms.
Oh, absolutely. It was a significant departure.
It sounds like the U.S. argument, though, based on the White House documents we looked at, was that this was kind of a necessary response because other countries just have much higher tariffs than the U.S. does on average.
That's a key part of their justification, yes.
Yes.
The argument was that the U.S. average MFN tariff rate is actually quite low, something like 3.3%.
That's pretty low, yeah.
Whereas, they argued, many of its major trading partners they specifically mentioned, places like Brazil, China, the European Union, India, Vietnam, have significantly higher average tariffs overall.
So they were pointing fingers a bit.
They were definitely highlighting the differences. They gave specific examples too, like the U.S. having a 2.5% tariff on passenger vehicles compared to the EU's 10% or India's 70%, China's 15%.
Wow, 70% in India.
According to that document, yes.
Oh.
And they pointed to similar differences in tariffs on things like network switches, ethanol, rice, apples, well, a whole range of products.
So the argument is essentially, hey, we play by relatively open rules, our tariffs are low, but other countries don't. They have high tariffs. So this reciprocal deficit-based thing is our way of pushing back on that imbalance.
That's the core of the argument they put forward, yes.
Okay.
And they also raise concerns about what are called non-tariff barriers in other countries.
Right, NTBs. Things other than tariffs that make trade harder.
Exactly. Things like complicated regulations, difficult licensing requirements, maybe product standards that seem designed to favor domestic producers. The U.S. argued that these NTBs, along with potentially lower domestic consumption rates in some trading partners, also contribute to these trade imbalances and a lack of, true reciprocity.
Okay, so just to make sure we've got this straight in our heads,
Mhm.
and for everyone listening, regular tariffs, various aims, raising money, protecting industries, and they generally operate within the WTO's MFN rule. Treat everyone similarly.
Hmm. Broadly speaking.
Reciprocal tariffs, at least in this recent 2025 example, are more about reacting to specific trade balances, these deficits, rather than directly mirroring other countries' tariffs on specific goods.
That's the key operational difference in that specific policy, yes.
And calculated using that deficit.
That's the general consensus, yes. Most economists believe that the overall trade balance of a country, and often its bilateral balances with specific partners, are driven primarily by bigger macroeconomic factors.
Like what?
Things like national saving rates versus national investment rates. A country that consistently spends more than it produces or invests more than it saves domestically is likely to run a trade deficit, pretty much regardless of its tariff policies.
So tariffs are more like a symptom or maybe a tool used for other reasons, but not the root cause of the overall deficit.
That's how most mainstream economists view it. Trying to eliminate a trade deficit purely through tariffs without addressing those underlying saving and investment dynamics is generally seen as unlikely to succeed and could even backfire, could even lead to negative consequences like slower growth or even a recession.
Okay, so let's talk about those potential negative consequences. Based on what you've seen in the sources, what are some of the expected impacts if a country like the U.S. goes down this road of reciprocal tariffs based on trade deficits? What happens here at home?
Well, the potential downsides for the country imposing these tariffs, like the U.S. in this scenario, are pretty significant according to most analyses.
Like higher prices.
That's usually the first and most direct impact felt by consumers, yeah.
Mhm.
Higher prices on imported goods. When tariffs increase the cost of bringing goods into the country, those costs often get passed along at the checkout.
Makes sense.
Plus, if there's less competition from imports because of the tariffs, domestic producers might also feel less pressure to keep their prices down.
So double whammy potentially. And who feels that the most?
It tends to hit lower and middle income families hardest, as they spend a larger portion of their income on basic goods, many of which might be imported or contain imported components. Some analyses we saw estimated these kinds of broad reciprocal tariffs could increase household expenses by anywhere from, say, $1,200 to $3,400 a year.
Ouch. That's a real chunk of change for a lot of families. What about for businesses here in the U.S.? Is it good for them?
It's likely to be a very mixed bag for American businesses. Sure, companies that directly compete with the imported goods that now face tariffs might see a temporary boost in sales, less foreign competition.
Okay, some winners maybe.
Potentially, in the short term. However, a huge part of the U.S. economy, especially manufacturing, relies heavily on components, parts, raw materials that are imported.
Right, global supply chain.
Exactly. For those companies, tariffs mean higher production costs. That makes them less competitive, both here at home and when trying to sell overseas. That could potentially lead to lower production, maybe even job losses in those sectors.
So helping one industry might hurt another.
It often does. And then, of course, there's the retaliation risk we talked about. If other countries slap their own tariffs on U.S. goods in response
Then our exporters get hit.
directly, which
Yeah.
hurts American businesses trying to sell abroad, farmers, manufacturers, you name it.
And what's the overall outlook for the U.S. economy as a whole under this kind of tariff regime based on the forecasts?
Most macroeconomic forecasts suggest a net negative impact on overall economic growth. Some even raised concerns about an increased risk of recession if these tariffs were broad and sustained.
Really? Recession risk?
It was definitely mentioned as a possibility in some analyses. We actually saw a pretty sharp negative reaction in the financial markets when these reciprocal tariffs were first announced in 2025. Stock prices dropped significantly.
I remember that. It felt a bit like the market reaction at the start of the COVID lockdowns.
Very similar
Yeah.
initial shock, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of market plunge and uncertainty can also make consumers feel less wealthy. The negative wealth effect, which might lead them to cut back on spending, further slowing down the economy. And longer term, there's another worry some economists have, that these tariffs could kind of distort investment, encouraging capital to flow towards less efficient domestic producers who are now shielded from competition, which could actually lower overall productivity growth over time.
So not exactly the guaranteed economic win that might be promised when these policies are rolled out.
Generally, the consensus among economists, based on the sources, points towards more costs than benefits for the overall economy imposing them.
Okay, what about the countries on the receiving end, the ones getting hit by these U.S. tariffs? What kind of pain are they looking at?
Oh, the impact on those targeted countries could be very serious, particularly for developing economies that rely really heavily on exports to the U.S. market.
Like the Lesotho example you mentioned, with a potential 49% tariff.
Exactly. Or think about Cambodia, which is a major exporter of textiles and apparel to the U.S. If the U.S. imposes very high tariffs, the economic consequences there could be, well, disastrous. Major job losses, factory closures.
That sounds devastating.
It could be. And, as we've already hammered home, these countries would almost certainly respond with their own tariffs on American goods, hurting U.S. exporters in turn.
Which then brings us back to the really big picture worry, the potential for a global trade war, right?
Exactly. That's the biggest systemic risk. This kind of tit-for-tat tariff action, especially if it's based on something as volatile as bilateral trade deficits, could easily escalate.
How does that escalate?
Well, country A puts tariffs on country B. Country B retaliates against A. Maybe country C gets sideswiped or feels it needs to react too. Pretty soon you have multiple major economies imposing tariffs on each other.
And that would just gum up the works globally.
Completely. It disrupts those complex international supply chains that modern businesses rely on. It drives up costs for companies and consumers everywhere. It reduces the overall flow of goods, services, and investment across borders. This kind of widespread trade disruption can have severe negative consequences for global economic growth, potentially tipping the world into recession.
Okay, now, the term reciprocal in trade policy, it isn't entirely new, is it? I remember reading about something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, way back in the 1930s. How does that fit into this whole picture? Was that the same idea?
That's a really important historical point to bring up, and no, it wasn't the same idea at all, really. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, or RTAA, from 1934 was a landmark piece of legislation, hugely important.
Okay.
But it's crucial to understand that it used the term reciprocal in a very different sense than these modern, often deficit-based reciprocal tariffs we've been discussing.
Different how?
The RTAA gave the U.S. president the authority to negotiate bilateral reciprocal trade agreements with other countries. And the main goal, the explicit purpose of these agreements, was to reduce tariffs mutually.
Reduce them, not raise them.
Exactly. Lower them. It's widely credited, actually, with kind of ushering in an era of more liberal, more open trade policies for the United States, moving away from the extreme protectionism of the earlier period.
So it was about the U.S. saying, hey, we'll lower our tariffs on your stuff if you lower your tariffs on our stuff. A mutual lowering of barriers.
Precisely. The RTAA came about in the aftermath of the Great Depression and the disastrously high tariffs imposed by the Smoot-Hawley Act just a few years earlier.
Right. Smoot-Hawley often gets blamed for worsening the Depression.
Many historians and economists believe it did. So the RTAA was a conscious effort to move away from that kind of protectionism. The idea was to stimulate international trade by negotiating these reciprocal deals to lower tariffs, hoping it would help the U.S. and global economies recover.
That's a pretty significant contrast to how the term reciprocal seems to be used now, where it's often about raising barriers as a reaction or based on these deficit numbers.
It's a huge contrast. The historical RTAA was fundamentally about mutual tariff reduction through negotiation. The modern concept we've been discussing, particularly the 2025 example, involves potentially raising tariffs, often unilaterally, based on criteria like trade deficits. Very different philosophies.
Got it. And just looping back to those 2025 reciprocal tariffs for a moment, we even saw some adjustments pretty quickly after they were announced, didn't we? Certain types of goods were exempted.
Yes, that's correct. Shortly after the initial announcement and the market reaction, the U.S. government did carve out exceptions for certain categories of imports.
What kind of things got exempted?
The most notable ones were things like smartphones, computers, and semiconductor chips. Pretty major categories.
Yeah, big consumer electronics and tech components. Any idea what the thinking might have been behind those specific exemptions? Why exempt phones and chips, but maybe not other things?
Well, we can only speculate, but there are likely a few reasons. One major factor is probably the immediate and very visible impact on American consumers. Tariffs on iPhones or laptops. People notice that price increase right away.
Yeah, that would not be popular.
Probably not. Another big reason could be the potential harm to other U.S. industries. Think about how many American companies, big and small, rely heavily on imported chips or components for their own products.
Right, disrupting their supply chains.
Exactly. Imposing tariffs on those critical inputs could raise their costs, mess up production, and make those U.S. companies less competitive globally. And, it's also quite possible that lobbying from these powerful affected industries played a significant role in securing those exemptions.
Okay, that all makes sense. So, to really try and boil this all down, the key takeaway for you listening is this. While both regular and reciprocal tariffs are taxes on goods coming into a country,
Hmm.
they differ fundamentally in their objectives and, maybe more importantly, how they're put into practice. Regular tariffs serve a range of purposes, revenue, protection, and generally operate, or are supposed to operate, within the established international trade rules of the WTO, like MFN.
Right, the traditional approach.
The modern reciprocal tariffs, particularly as we saw in that recent 2025 example, are often presented as a direct response to trade practices or imbalances with other countries. But crucially, in that case, they were calculated based on overall trade deficits, not specific tariff matching.
Very different calculation method.
And they tend to involve raising trade barriers, unlike those historical reciprocal trade agreements under the RTAA, which were all about lowering them.
That's a perfect and concise way to summarize the key differences, I think. And as we've definitely discussed throughout this newer approach, this deficit-based reciprocity, carries significant potential economic risks and really raises some big questions about the future direction of global trade relations.
Absolutely. It makes you think, doesn't it? So, given this historical evolution from high tariffs to the RTAA push for lowering them to the WTO system, and now this current debate around a different kind of reciprocity, what does this potential shift towards deficit-based tariffs really signal about where global trade might be headed?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah. Are we moving towards a more, I don't know, confrontational, maybe less cooperative world of international commerce? It's definitely something to ponder, the different philosophies at play here and what the long-term consequences of these kinds of policies could be for businesses, for you as a consumer, and just for the global economy as a whole. Lots to think about.